Well, welcome to this 7th Humane Conversation. As you know, the idea behind Humane Conversations is to engage with colleagues here at the UvA that do research with, in, and about AI, and thereby explore this whole breadth of AI-related research at the UvA along all faculties. And also help us to meet new colleagues and encounter new ideas, especially in these times where we all work from home. And it has gotten much more difficult to simply bump into people and meet new people. Humane Conversations is an initiative of the research priority area Humane AI, which brings together existing and initiates new research on the societal, ethical, and legal consequences of the rapid development of AI in our society. Previous conversations can be found on the website, and Jonata has put a link into the chat, such as, for example, our last conversation with Marieke van Erp from the Cultural AI Lab. And also this conversation will be recorded and later placed on the website. And by this, also a question to the panelists: are you all okay with us recording this session for being able to put it on the website later?
That's fine.
Yes.
Would be difficult to say no now.
Well, you if you say no, it won't be put on the website. Okay, thanks so much. And on the website, you also can find more information about the research priority area and its new activities, including the new conversations for the next season. Before moving to today's conversation and introducing our guests, I first of all would like to extend a very warm thanks to Jonata, our community manager, who pulled Humane Conversations off the ground in the last years and many more of our initiatives. And if there's a possibility to do so, I would very much would like to give you a virtual fireworks and a lot of clapping on your shoulder, Jonata. Thanks so much. I would also like to thank Claes de Vreese, who was the RPA director for this year, and announce our director for the next year, Tobias Blanke. And I know that Claes and Tobias have already practiced virtual handshakes that you probably can't see now, but that they're doing right now. About today, I very much hope we have an animated discussion, and I invite all of you, also your participants, to join. Please introduce your comments and questions in the chat, and Jonata and I will monitor the chat and try to infuse as many of your questions and comments into the conversation. And I would also like to invite the speakers to respond to each other and the questions from the audience. But now, we're super happy and very honored that we can end this first season of Humane AI Conversations with 3 very distinguished and expert colleagues here at UvA that each in their way have a significant impact on the way we think, we teach, and we research matters related to AI. Professor Beate Roessler is a professor of ethics at the University of Amsterdam and the chair of the Capacity Group of Philosophy and Public Affairs. And since 2019, she's also the chair of the Department of Philosophy. Then we have Dr. Raquel Fernández, an associate professor at the Institute for Logic, Language and Computation at the University of Amsterdam here, where she leads the dialogue modeling group, and her research is concerned with computational semantics and pragmatics. And we have Professor Max Welling. His research chair is in machine learning here at the UvA, and he is a vice president technologies at Qualcomm. And the title of today's session is Getting It Right, AI and Academia. And when talking about AI, we academics actually have many hats on. We teach the new generation of AI experts and users of AI. Some of us build AI, many of us use AI in their research, yet others do critical research about how AI impacts users in society, laws, and public values. We advise law and policy makers when they're making our AI rules, as well as companies. And sometimes we also join companies in translating our research into innovations that then enter the market. We do research together. So that we in academia get AI right is crucial in many respects. And the conversation we're having today was inspired by two previous Humane AI conversations, one with Beate and one with Max, about their research in AI. And something that became clear within and between these two conversations was that getting it right is easier said than done. On the one hand, there's a strong momentum for innovation in AI, for pioneering new applications and further developing and testing technology. And if we follow the media, popular literature, public debates, but also experts in the field, the sky seems to be the limit. On the other hand, many of these technologies and applications are not built for the sake of research and innovation only, but to be applied and to function in our society. And it's widely expected that they will transform our society, our markets, our institutions, our public values in many anticipated and maybe also less expected ways, often to the better and sometimes to the worse. The UvA is strong on both perspectives, the technical and the societal perspective from AI, and therefore it's an excellent place to bring these two perspectives into conversation, which is also an important ambition of our research priority area, Humane AI. So together with our speakers, the goal of today is to explore the nexus between computer science and ethical and social sciences and the ways of making the combination of these perspectives work actually in teaching and in research. This conversation is also super topical. As many of you know, the European Commission just launched its proposal for an AI regulation and the communication about its future AI strategy. And the European approach to AI is decidedly human and value-centric. And for those interested into the regulation, something that you also can find on our website is the possibility to join an impromptu debate about the new AI regulation organized by the Institute for Information Law next week. So the focus of the EU regulation is very much human-centric AI. And I would be interested to learn from you three, what exactly is human-centric AI to you and how is it relevant in your research? And maybe Raquel, you would like to start.
Hi, so hello everybody. I'm glad to be here. Well, so you're asking what is human-centric AI? I don't know. I mean, personally, I am a practitioner of AI, right? So my field is computational linguistics, natural language processing. So I develop models that use AI, in particular machine learning, to deal with aspects that have to do with language. And from a perspective where my goal is mostly to try to understand human language, but using these AI techniques. Right? So when I think about what's human-centric AI in the context of ethics, what comes to mind is the idea of being able to reflect a little bit beyond your problem, to reflect about how what you are doing may have an impact on society at large. Right? And it's something that it is not so easy when you are a researcher yourself that do basic research, because you tend to be confined within the boundaries of your very specific problem, right? But if you, so I think that that in the context of ethics, it would be the ability to think a bit beyond your specific problem in research about the impact that this may have in society.
Thank you, Raquel. Beate.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good to be here. So yes, what does it mean to me? It means that AI not only is focused on efficiency or, you know, just because it's interesting to play the games, just play along, but that we always have the individual and social democratic good life before our eyes. And I think what Raquel just said is a very good starting point. You have to start wherever you are, in whichever context you are in your research, you have to reflect upon what you're doing. Now, we usually think this is self-evident, but with AI, it's especially important because you not only have to think about the consequences, but also you have to see that you as a scientist or as a researcher have an ethic code as well. So it's always these two aspects. You have a certain commitment as a researcher, and you have the commitment to look at the consequences of the results of your research. This is nothing new, of course. We always knew it, and it's in all sorts of ethics guidelines. I looked it up. I especially looked it up for the science department and the ILLC, but they're very good, very clear. Yeah, because I know my own guidelines, I mean, for philosophy and in the Faculty of Humanities. So I think we don't even have to reflect a lot about whether everybody should do it. It's more a question of how they do it and what importance it has in their work. And so this is what I would like AI to do. But in my research, I'm basically busy. When I do research on AI, I'm basically busy with criticisms of practices of AI or research practices. So yes, that's what we do.
Thank you, Beate. And Max.
Yeah, thank you, Natali, for asking me to be here. It's a big pleasure to be part of this discussion. For me, human-centric AI is that part of AI which directly interacts with humans and makes decisions about humans, and to make sure that that AI acts responsibly, and when it takes decisions about people, it does so in a transparent way, explainable for those who get impacted by those decisions, etc. Sometimes called responsible by design, so that these algorithms do not have to be sort of corrected after the fact, but you just design it into the system that it is privacy preserving, responsible, respectful, doesn't discriminate against people, etc. So there is a spectrum, in my opinion. So there is certainly a lot of AI that directly interacts with humans and makes decisions about humans, and we have to be extremely careful with this AI. And we've seen that this has gone wrong a few times already in society. There's also a lot of AI that not so many people see necessarily, that goes on behind the scenes and that has much less interaction with humans. Maybe to give an example, we build systems that design chips. So, you can either have the chip designed by a human, or you have a big machine sort of optimize the chip for you, and then you look at it and then you say, this is a good design, or it's not such a good design, right? And so in that sense, I think that particular system doesn't interact very much with humans directly, and is somewhat on the other side of the spectrum. And so that, I would argue, is not so human-centric AI. But there is this whole spectrum, and I think we have to take note of that.
And where exactly would you draw the line between AI that does and does not interact with humans?
Well, so the whole point of this is to say that you should not draw a line, because that's already making it binary. So I think there's a spectrum. You can give examples which are on one far side of the spectrum, right? Which is a system that decides whether you get a loan for a bank. Clearly, that's a decision that takes that's a system that takes direct decisions about people, has direct impact on people's lives, and that's very human centric, I would say, or that should be very human centric. So the design of that system should be very transparent, explainable, and non-discriminatory, etc. And basically, there's other systems where humans do not get directly impacted by the system, where maybe humans interact with the system, right? So you could ask a system to optimize a particular design, and of course then you will get the design and look at the design. But humans only get impacted very far down the line. All right, this chip goes into your phone, and then that enables particular things in your phone, like apps, and then at that point it starts to interact with humans. So the line from the actual AI system towards where it actually impacts society is much longer.
Okay, Raquel and Beate, would you like to respond to what has been said so far? Because that also that also contradicts a bit what both of you said, that, and also what the Commission says. I mean, I'm quoting the European Commission and its communication. Starting with the launch of the European AI strategy, we have a two-pronged policy to make the EU a world-class hub for AI while ensuring that AI is human-centric and trustworthy. So essentially all AI must be human-centric and trustworthy. And Max's argument is, okay, there are certain forms of AI that that maybe do not necessarily need to be human-centric and trustworthy. And the question is, how do you decide in which situation this is and is not the case? Are there any insights from philosophy, for example?
Well, look, I don't think you can draw a line, as Max said, in fact, but I don't think you can even say that some of the AI, like the chip in your phone, is only based on what he said, Max said, good or bad design. So what is good or bad design? It's not just design which is rational or efficient or anything like that. It's, of course, also design which should serve a certain purpose, and the purpose should not be separated from the ethics of the society we're living in. So I think it's a sort of scientific self-deception, not especially you, Max, of course, but a general sort of idea or illusion, I should say, that there are aspects of science or research, or especially in AI, which are completely neutral, in which can be sort of put to purpose in different contexts, and it's only those contexts which are then to be valued along ethical lines. I also think can I just read very briefly something from the ILLC guidelines? ILLC researchers need to be aware of the fact that research results, once published or shared by other means, can be used by others in ways that are not intended and that may be harmful. Potential unintended use or misuse of results resulting research can sometimes deliver knowledge that can be used for unintended purposes, illegal activities, or societally, ethically disputable applications. Now, of course, we can't expect every scientist to, know the consequences of their research. I totally agree with Max in that. The only thing I think we can do is always have sort of contexts which are focused on questions like that one in the ILLC guidelines. So contexts in which scientists reflect together on possible bad or good consequences. I think that's part of the idea that we as researchers are committed to the ethics of the good individual and democratic life.
Right.
Oh, yeah, Raquel, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I just very briefly, right? So I do think that's why I started by highlighting that the main aspect, I think, is this ability to reflect, right? Because so Max, on the other hand, put more emphasis on maybe outlining what should be the features of human-centric AI, for example, explainable, etc. Right? And this is pretty strong already. So if you define it like this, then of course, then it's very difficult to say, okay, does it mean that at all levels of research, from very fundamental to more applied, you need to ensure, for instance, explainability and this? That would be really strong. I don't think that is actually possible, right? So that's why I started a little bit less strong than that. I do agree with Beate that the need to reflect about ethical questions, that should be at all levels, really, right? And it might be difficult for the researcher to actually adopt this perspective, but I do think that there is value in having that at all levels. Then what that means in practice in terms of what features the research needs to have, that I think is a very complex issue where I would not like to see very specific restrictions on what is required, right?
So if I can, so I think I actually disagree with the fact that in the EU regulations, they don't distinguish between these different things. There's actually risk levels defined. And I'm actually very happy with this sort of level of sophistication, where they say there is particular AI which is deemed, highly dangerous, and certain AI is actually completely banned. And then there's others which are in very low risk levels where the EU doesn't want to interfere all that much with regulation. And I think that's precisely the right attitude. It doesn't really help to say everything is dangerous, we need to regulate everything, or we need to discuss endlessly the dangers of everything. It's just not very helpful. I think you need to focus on the most important and the most dangerous parts of AI. And actually, I completely agree with Raquel about the fundamental versus non-fundamental research. So it's not very helpful to talk to a mathematician who does numerical analysis or tries to improve some PDE system or whatever, to ask him constantly about, or her constantly about, the ethical implications of that, right? I think for me the most important thing is basically, if you think that mathematics is important, right, then the most important role of that mathematician is to inform society about what he or she is doing, right? But if on the other hand there is people who work on direct applications, so there's again a very big and important spectrum. Now, if there's people who work on direct applications, and I think actually natural language processing is a very important application where you translate something from one language in another language. Clearly, that's where, based on the data sets that you're using, all sorts of biases can creep in. And that's where we have to have a very important sort of discussion about, how can we avoid these things in the ethical aspects. So again, I want to say, let's not treat everything the same. Let's just state that there are just differences and there's a spectrum in these things, and treat them accordingly.
I never said anything about endlessly discussing, Max. Let's just be a little bit careful about the framing. I mean, we can disagree, but on the right things we should disagree, okay?
I shouldn't have said endless.
Which is indeed also the very much core to the risk-based approach. I think one challenge there is how do we identify whether an AI is risky for human society, fundamental rights, and along the line of which, and I think the more we understand about AI applications, sometimes the origins of risks to fundamental rights come from unexpected parts of AI that we never thought of would influence this process. So I think that, yeah, I'm curious how you see that, and also the role of research in that, and how could that be implemented into the research practices, or also for identifying. So do we want to leave this question of what is risky AI to the European Commission that will draw an annex and update it once a year, or how can we operationalize this obligation? Any ideas on that one?
But maybe, so I'm not fully familiar with the current proposal. I've read a bit through it, but maybe you can illuminate me a little bit. If I understand correctly, the proposal is about regulating applications, right? So applications that are deployed, and right? So I wonder, to me it's not entirely clear what that means for the researchers themselves. So very often, in my case, and many people, so we do the fundamental research that potentially may lead to an application, but you don't directly develop the application that then can go into the market, right? And therefore, I'm not sure whether the EU regulations are telling us much that we can directly use in our everyday research.
Yeah. There was actually a question directly related to that in the chat from Tobias Blanke to the panelists. What do you think is the biggest obstacle to working on responsible and ethical AI within research and or business?
Yeah, can I say something about that?
Yeah.
Very briefly. I think one of the obstacles is that the researchers are all the same, so to speak. So I want to say two things. First, the diversity of research teams would be very good in order to prevent any sort of biases, even in rather fundamental research. I'm not so convinced about as Max knows, and I mean, we know each other's points of view, so that's rather easy to disagree. So I think diversity of research teams and diversity of the ethics context, which discusses certain research projects, not endlessly, but every now and then, just to get used to the idea. I mean, most people are used to the idea that they should reflect on what they're doing. And how do you reflect? Well, you reflect along certain ethical or other guidelines. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that I find the idea that we can make a clear-cut difference, as Natali also asked, a clear-cut difference between research which will never be applied, which is sort of probably harmless, and research which is very clearly applied. I think, I mean, there are very many scientists out there who disagree with this idea, who say that even very fundamental research might be used at some point for, you know, things which are not good but bad, to use Max's difference. And I've just started reading the biography of Oppenheimer, and I must say that even, I mean, okay, you all know it, of course, you all know his life and his views on what he did. And I think that's just one example to think about what we are doing. I mean, ethicists have to think about what they're doing as well. It's not just scientists. Everybody should do that. We are all researchers and scientists with a certain commitment to ethical and democratic rules, and that counts for every sort of research.
Okay, so I don't disagree with the point of view that we should all reflect on ethics, but the question is, where can I do this most effectively, right? And if I work on an actual application that has direct impact on society, then it is really important that I talk to, you know, an ethics board or an ethics committee to talk to them about this particular application, right? If I do fundamental research, if I'm a mathematician, I think that's not a very effective way to go, because, you know, that's a formality that doesn't make any sense. However, thinking about ethics and about AI and about the impact of mathematics on society in general, the biggest impact you can have is to educate your politicians, right? To tell them about what is the long-term impact of what you are doing. It's not immediate. Whatever you're doing now is not going to be immediate, but in the long term it could have an impact. And so you would then, you know, maybe write in popular media or enter in discussions, or, you know, when you get invited by parliamentarians, you explain to them what you're doing. I think that's perhaps the most effective way then to have that ethical you know, fulfill that ethical responsibility that you're talking about.
Yes, and we come to the role of politicians, hopefully also in a moment. There was another question in the chat that very much follows up on this discussion of the question of how to make sure that we identify at the right moment ethical implications. And this question is from Miriam Koos, whether it's necessary to enforce AI scientists to reflect on ethics. And in research with participants, it's common to have an independent ethical committee reviewing proposals to enforce this. Would it sense to make that also apply for AI research? And that is also what I hear you saying, Max, that there are certain forms of AI research that will have to pass an ethical board. And but there are other forms of research that we traditionally do not submit to ethics reviews. For example, the work of the mathematician. Is what you're saying, Beate, that we should start doing that, or what other way could be there to also submit more fundamental research to an ethics assessment?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think it would be very good to have this just institutionalized, not a board with 5 members who, you know, take months in order to read something, but something from the community itself, which, you know, where people could just discuss on a regular basis what they're doing. I mean, you know, I'm not talking about ethical guidelines, which we first have to learn. I'm talking about ethical guidelines and ideas of democracy, which we all should know about anyway. So I'm more thinking of something for every research context, like let's meet every now and then. I don't know how often, I mean, you know, that would be your job to decide, Max, but and discuss every research we're doing. Could that have possible consequences? Is it really just mathematics? And just let's be open to that question, because we all don't know what's going to happen with AI. That's so interesting on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's also something which endangers our democracy and our individual lives. So we have to be specifically careful here on another level than on the levels we know. I mean, this technology, as we know, is transformative, it's disruptive. So it's new in a way which can confront us with new problems. And I'm not sort of the ethical police woman. I just say, let's think about all these problems more often than we've done before, and with more expertise maybe than we had before. I think that's really important. And I think if we don't do that, we'll probably encounter even more problems with AI than we will encounter anyway.
One of the solutions that the European Commission suggests is some sort of regulatory sandbox where applications can be tested upon their compliance with laws and ethics. So is what you may be suggesting, Beate, some sort of ethical sandbox where you could critical questions, developments and trends, and simply reflect where it could go, what kind of impacts they could have? And would that maybe also a role that you could see here at the UvA?
I think we have to start on a far more sort of basic level, like us, the university, should talk about the research we are doing on a regular basis. And then we will encounter problematic cases where we might disagree, and then we can go to, you know, different levels. But why not start at our level and just talk about every research we are doing connected to AI with groups within the university? That's far more sort of a lower threshold than the one, you know, with an ethics board or, you know, sending things to Brussels. Or I didn't think of that. I think we have to learn that AI is a sort of technology and research which demands different forms of discussion and ethical evaluation. And we can start here at the university. We don't need to, I mean, we can also, if we want to, we can go to other places, but we have lawyers here at the university, we've got ethical people, we've got lots of scientists who know about all these ethical and other problems connected to it. So why not stay here and first, you know, implement an idea that every context of every AI could maybe deliver problems we don't know about yet. That's the only thing I want to suggest.
And Max and Raquel, if you want to respond to that, then I trust you taking the floor.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I think that to respond more directly to the question by this person in the audience, I personally would not be happy with a board that would have the role of approving or disapproving a certain research, a plan for research, because I think that's probably impossible to put into place, and I think it would be actually detrimental for the research. So definitely not that. I see that Beate was not advocating for that at all. So yeah, I don't think that having a board of this kind would be the solution, or it would help. Of course, encouraging having opportunities for discussing what we are doing with scholars that are beyond the Faculty of Science in particular, and our own work that could be very useful and enlightening. I don't see very precisely how it could be put into place, but yeah, I think it could be useful to move towards something like that.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of that already happening, of course, and I think so. I think this is a good plan. I mean, there's absolutely, it's a good idea to get people in the same room, especially, you know, from very interdisciplinary backgrounds, and to have them discuss. So I think that's a great idea. It shouldn't be mandatory, so that's different. I think for certain things like dangerous applications, yes, there I think certain things should be mandatory. You have to move things through ethical committees, I believe. But having people participate in these types of interdisciplinary discussions are very useful. In fact, I do participate in these things as well, and you know, and with great joy. So actually the fact that we are sitting here is also already a testament that we are all interested in this topic to some degree. So I think that's perfectly fine. I think I wouldn't do it within the department necessarily, because I think it's not going to work. Because you know, I think it has to be some interdisciplinary. We have to sort of engage with, you know, each other and sort of across the various disciplines for this to make sense. Yeah.
There is also already a vivid conversation going on in the Q&A and in the chat. The one Arnold points out that actually this discussion in academia is one place to have this discussion, but he also points to the importance of having these discussions also in society out there, so also outside academia, and wonders whether for the virtue of society to generate many small projects and make many mistakes, whether that would not be the way to go. So the classical, the approach, try it and see whether it goes wrong. And what do you think about this test-based approach? Anybody wants to respond to that?
Well, yes, I'll be very brief because I feel, Raquel, you should say more, but just very briefly, I think that's a dangerous path. I just went to a workshop with one paper was on the danger of normalization of certain technologies by just using them. So if we try out, for instance, certain techniques, then we get used to it. And the more we get used to it, the more normal it will be. And everything which is normal is, and that they have sort of lots of interviews and really empirical research, things that we find normal, we also find good. That's just a tendency, apparently. I don't find that very flattering, but apparently that's the case. So I think this slippery slope is very dangerous, to just try it and see how it works, because we, as we know, get very quickly used to these technologies and then think, you know, nothing wrong with that.
Raquel and Max, you want to respond to that question?
Well, I guess I think we always have to monitor, you know, the effects and act quickly if things go bad. So that's, you know, and things are being tried if we want it or not. I mean, I think the innovation is going so incredibly fast at this point. There's not an ethical committee for everything that's happened, and certainly not in every sort of company where things, you know, have their own dynamics. So to make sure, you know, things are tried, they will be tried if we want it or not. And so therefore monitoring what's happening, and in particular, and the short-term issues are probably not the most important ones. Of course, yeah, you know, you can detect them and you can correct them, but it's the long-term impacts that are most worrying, right? I think not many people had sort of anticipated what was happening with Facebook, right? It was happening right in front of our eyes. You know, we could have seen it perhaps if we would have thought long and hard about it, but still it came as a surprise, right? And I think that's really important. And maybe that's also has something to do with the fact that there's not enough people who actually do understand the depth of the technology. And certainly I would say lawmakers and regulators, you know, they have very different backgrounds typically. And they and maybe even philosophers, right? You know, they're not right into this topic. And so
I knew you would bring up that at a certain point. Thank you. Thank you for being predictable.
Well, I mean, it is, we will come to the question of how to explain and teach, prepare, for example, also decision makers for this really complex environment. There are also some questions in the chat about what is it actually that we should discussing about. And because before I move to that, there's another suggestion or possible suggestion or a question about a possible solution posed by Giovanni, who would like to ask what the speakers think of the recent task by Neuro IPS to mandate a broader impact statement to be added in every paper, which has to then include a discussion of the possible societal consequences of a piece of research, and what you think of this. According to Giovanna, this has led to some vitriologic discussions during the latest conferences with critiques, including critiques that reviewers are not trained to assess that. The question how these societal consequences should be researched, discussed. Are you familiar with this case?
Well, I think I will let Max start.
I know the case very well. You know, so again, for certain applications, this is very important. For others, it's less obvious, and it's quite clear that many of my students are struggling with trying to formulate, you know, when they're working on some very fundamental, you know, algorithm, then they have to figure out, okay, so, you know, of course I can, you know, think of tons and tons of positive and negative things, and it has to be squashed into like one paragraph. And for them, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to just diss up one, you know, negative impact and just write it there. It becomes a bit of a red herring. And so I think there should be an option to say, well, I'm working on a very fundamental issue. I like to decline. While for others, where it's clearly obvious that there are negative implications, it's very good for people to be aware of it or to think about it for, you know, 5 minutes and to make sure that they, you know, they think a little bit about the implications of what they do and to write it down. So for them, it is a very useful exercise.
Right. So in some natural language processing conferences, this is also started to become an issue, an aspect that has to be incorporated. Maybe not as a not a requirement for all papers, but so you can say whether your work has any ethical implications or not. You can decline. Otherwise you can write a paragraph that explains what might be the consequences. And so I in general find it a good idea, especially if it is optional but encouraged, right? But I have to say that basically we are all searching for best practices at the moment, right? At this point, the researchers don't know very well how to write these statements. The reviewers don't know very well how to assess these statements. And we are at this point in which we are still learning, still trying to find out what the best practices are, right? And then, so I think one question is, how are we going to get to these best practices? What kind of input do we need? Can we learn by ourselves, let's say, by looking only within the field, or do we need a more interdisciplinary approach, right? So I think we are moving in the right direction, but not everything is perfect at this moment. And I myself in my research feel that we are still searching for what's the best way to do things in a better manner.
Yeah, can I just briefly comment on that? I think you're both completely right. We don't have best practices yet, clearly, and also there has to be some competency in being able to judge fundamental research. And I absolutely freely admit that I'm not an expert on AI fundamental research. Max, you can't expect that from a philosopher. What you should expect is that I'm able as an ethicist to talk to other people about what possible consequences could fundamental research have. And I think it only comes to show that we need to learn to talk more about the ethical guidelines in all sorts of contexts, fundamental research or not so fundamental research. We have to get used to it. And I think that's what I tried to say when I said it's so new, and it's also something which can be, which will be very transformative of our everyday life, which already is, of course, but we need to learn to talk about these research projects more in an interdisciplinary and sort of relaxed way, and not with an ethics board. You always have to sort of, you have to justify your research. That's, that's not the sort of context I have before my eyes. It's more that different people get together and explain each other what they're doing. Okay.
That was precisely my point as well. So we need to explain each other what we are doing. That's why interdisciplinary discussions are good things to have.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and many of also your responses boil down to the competency questions, and there are simply new things we need to learn to be actually able to have this discussion. And Altan, I think, summarized it very nicely, that at the heart of the problem is maybe that too many people don't understand AI or AI ethics for that point, or more generally, the broader impact on AI. So how can we actually make work? How we can ensure that we learn that? And that has also, there were also some questions in the chat about, your role as educators of the future generation of academics and also politicians and people building these technologies. And if you could reflect on how you see your role here in enabling us as a society, as academics, as politicians, to have meaningful conversations about these questions. Would like to, who can I give the word first?
I have the feeling that I talk too much, so I'd be absolutely willing. It's probably true for both of us. So why don't you start, Raquel?
Sorry, yes. So okay, how do we see our problem? I'm not sure exactly how to address this directly, but so of course for quite some time we've had courses that are related to ethics in different technical fields, right? But still, this is not yet that well integrated, right? So as far as I know, in our master's program in AI at the UVA, it's only very recently since we have a course that addresses issues related to responsibility and fairness, right? So I think that this course started to be in place last year, if I'm not mistaken. Right. So before that, there was no specific course dedicated to ethics in a master's in AI, right? So, and at the moment we have this course, which I think is called Fairness, Accountability, Confidentiality, and Transparency in AI. It's an obligatory course in the first year of the master's, which seems very valuable, but for example, if you look at the description of the course, it specifies that it's a course that considers this issue from a technical perspective, right? So looking at what you can do from a technical perspective to assess algorithms and to potentially improve algorithms if they have any harmful issues, right? But it's from a technical perspective. So I think that to have something more directly related to ethics from a more societal perspective would also be valuable within an AI program. So I think that designing the curricula of the programs, there is still room for improvement there, right? And then of course there is our role as supervisors of research being done at the university, right? Supervisors of master thesis and obviously of PhD candidates and so on. And all these aspects just have to be more present somehow in our everyday practices.
Max, would you also like to respond? There are actually two dedicated questions also in the chat to you, also about this more risk-based approach. Jeff asked whether that is at least a didactic duty for educators to teach tomorrow technologies to create a reflective reflex. And Jill builds up on that and asks how you see your role as educator and the impact that this approach we have at the moment to outsource the question to ethics committees will have on the way science is thought about and taught also in classrooms.
Yeah, I think so. I completely agree that it's good to have these courses in our curriculum, and it's also true that this is something recent. So this is something that our modern realization that things can go badly wrong with this technology now is reflected in the curriculum, and I think that's very good. I also think it's not just in front of the classroom; it's also when you give presentations for sort of non-technical audiences. I even wrote a book, and the last part of that book is completely dedicated to dangers of AI for society. So I think there's all sorts of ways in which you can explain, how powerful the technique is and what that might mean for, for society. I think that's not just in front of the classroom, but also when you do public talks. It's interesting to think about, and I'm not doing that much, and I agree for technicians there could be something to be won here, which is when you talk to your students. That you also reflect so now and then on these issues together, and that's not something. I mean, our first reflex is to talk about the technical stuff and to write our papers and things like this, and so to make some time to talk about the impact that your work might have, and to make some space, maybe in a group discussion or something is a good idea, I think.
Which it always takes two parties to tango, and Christos reflects on also the role of students here, and he says that a lot of AI students, from his experience, strive to champion their knowledge in AI and the technical skills, and they simply find it unnecessary or an obstacle to study ethics. What would be your response to these students, Max?
Well, I think everybody has a right to have their own interests, right? And so it's true that some students, they're far more interested in the technical aspects and they should certainly specialize in it. But I think there's sort of a minimum, that you'd need to take in, right? So in the sense that you have to be conscious and aware of the impact of what you will create has on society. And so to have some discussions on that, and again, I would be much more comfortable to do this not just between technicians, technology oriented people, but maybe to have sort of an interdisciplinary course or a couple of lectures where we invite people like Beate to come and give a lecture on this, right? I think that's much more worthwhile than me talking to my students about, well, did you notice that Facebook had blah 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 or something like this, right? It's not, but it is good for everybody, I think, to reflect on it so now and actually I think everybody does, to be honest, because it's all over the news all the time. So I think there is some level of reflection already.
Yeah, but can I just add something? I think it's very important to have these courses. And I talked to a colleague from Eindhoven. They have standard courses for all students on ethics and on privacy. So 2 different courses. And I think that's really getting more and more important. And I think every student should have the attitude, this is important. I don't think we should teach students to have the attitude, this, you can do it, but you don't have to do it. I think it's so important to teach our students an attitude towards society and towards their own lives, which takes the dangers of AI more seriously than they have done so far. But I completely agree with you, Max, that we should have interdisciplinary courses. And we've got lots of young people. I mean, we've got a new Uday in philosophy of technology, Marjolein Lansing. She can teach this, in her sleep. And we've got other people who can really teach these things very well. It's just that we have to organize it. and every now and lecture on the dangers or the ethics of AI, I can do that, no problem. But I think it should be institutionalized in the teaching of all courses which have remotely to do with AI.
I think we could.
Yeah,
Raquel?
So yeah, so I think, you know, this would not be so difficult to organize. Right? So I mentioned the course that is already in place in the Masters of AI. I think that some guest lectures in that course coming from people at the Faculty of Humanities would be relatively easy to organize, right? Well, we should talk to the teacher of the course, of course, but in principle, it shouldn't be that difficult. So that would be something that could be achieved. But I wanted to ask you, so do you think, Beate, that the people that could give these lectures, including you and others, that you have the right level of understanding? So you would be talking to AI students, right? The right level of understanding of what these students will be dealing with to actually have, how to put it, I don't want to say authority, you know, but to have so that they will indeed listen to you because you see what I mean?
Spit it out. Yeah, you don't think I'm sufficiently competent in AI?
No, I want to. I'm curious, and I'm just sincerely curious to know what you think, or what kind of knowledge you think you would need. To play this role.
I totally see your point, but we are not completely unexperienced in this. I mean, for a start, we have since years and years we have privacy courses where lots of informatics students participate as well, and in the ideal case, they explain to the class what their problems are in AI, and other students, philosophy students, for instance, explain why privacy is so valuable. So, you know, of course, there has to be bridges have to be built in courses like that, but I think it's completely not impossible to build these bridges, or even stronger, I think it's necessary to have these bridges built, not only for the students to learn about ethics, but for the society to be able to understand. And I think Max is completely right. It's not only students, it's also, you know, any sort of publics where we usually talk to show them what, you know, where the problems might be and what the problems, not only for the individuals, that's what I find so important, but for the democracy, for our democratic living together, where the dangers lie.
Actually, and I have one other thing which I wanted to add to this is we focus a lot on AI here, and you know, clearly, you know, that's an important. But there's a lot of other topics in the sciences like chemistry, physics, you know, where a lot of things are done which also have a huge impact, right? Like, and I think, and again, if it gets closer to the application. And commercialization, it's more and more important to have this discussion. And in some sense, I don't think we should single out AI, although it's been clear that that has a huge impact. We should also do this across actually all of these disciplines.
Thank you. I'm afraid our time is up, which I deeply regret because I think we could continue for another hour if I had more questions. Room for asking you more questions. One of those would be if we really think that we can reduce all issues about AI in society to matter of ethics and privacy only, or also need to re-broaden our thinking there. And some remarks in the chat from Christoph and Sarah, for example, pointed out to other trade-offs or balances that must be made between, for example, ethics, but also utility gains, or what are actually the values that we should measure these technologies against it, and what, for example, the role of efficiency considerations is. You all pointed out to a clear role also for society, and I think Christoph also made a good point. So yeah, in order to interest as computer science students for also the ethical question, there would be also some market demand for that. So there's certainly also a role for society to take its responsibility in there. I would very much like to thank you all, Raquel, Beate, Max, and the active audience for this really, really great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To be continued.
Thank you very much, Natali. Bye-bye.